player on the team for years sees his former coach on his deathbed 10 years later. When they spoke, the ex-coach was left speechless. George Miller was a legend of college basketball, with 7 consecutive championships and an unbeatable team. But life takes unexpected turns, and today he fights to survive. An unexpected encounter with a once successful former protege may be the key to a new beginning. The sun was setting over the small college town, once vibrant with the energy of basketball championships. George Miller, now with gray hair and wrinkles etched by time, walked the streets, pushing a recycling cart. His steps echoed on the sidewalk, reflecting the monotony of his new life. He paused for a moment, gazing at the old gymnasium where he had so often led the local basketball team to victory. That place, now desolate and covered in graffiti, was a shadow of the glorious past he had once been so proud of. George had led the team to 7 consecutive state championships, a feat never before seen at the university. His eyes filled with tears as he recalled the packed bleachers and deafening cheers. He was a legend, a brilliant strategist who turned promising young players into stars. However, time had not been kind to him. The pinnacle of his career was followed by a series of painful defeats. The fans' expectations, once so high, became unbearable pressure. The spark in his players' eyes, which had once reflected confidence and determination, faded with each successive loss. The university's administration, which once treated him like a hero, now saw him as a burden. "George, we thank you for everything, but it's time for a change," they said at the end of his last season. He was removed from the team, carrying with him the bitter reputation of being the coach with the most consecutive losses. The streets of the city that once echoed with the sound of his victories now felt cold and indifferent. Today, George did odd jobs to survive. He collected recyclables and did occasional gardening and construction work. Life was hard, but he refused to succumb to despair. He held on to his dignity and the silent pride of someone who had once been at the top. His greatest solace was the memories of his glory days, even though they were tainted by the bitter end. "It feels like 2 different lives," he muttered to himself as he stacked empty bottles in his cart. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Jonathan Davis, one of George's most talented protégés, returned for a brief visit. Now a professional and wealthy basketball player, Jonathan fondly remembered his years under George's guidance. He was part of the golden era of the team, when every game was a celebration of talent and strategy. Jonathan had followed a brilliant path in basketball, achieving fame and fortune, but he never forgot his roots. He parked his luxury car in front of his mansion, feeling a bit nostalgic. Upon arriving at his luxurious mansion, Jonathan, tired from the trip, accidentally hit a wall with his car. The incident was minor, but it left a mark on the structure. A few days later, he noticed someone repairing the damage. Curious, he approached to see who was working. A middle-aged man, with a tired but determined appearance, was crouched down, fixing the wall. Something about the man seemed familiar to Jonathan, but he couldn't quite place where he knew him from. Jonathan observed the man for a moment, trying to connect scattered memories. It might just be a coincidence, he thought, but there was something about the man's posture, the way he moved, that felt familiar. Jonathan decided to get closer. He cleared his throat, preparing to speak, and called out, "Excuse me, sir. Have we met before?" The man looked up, revealing tired but attentive eyes. Their gazes met, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. George recognized Jonathan but tried to hide his surprise, focusing back on his work. "Maybe," he replied softly. Jonathan, now more curious, moved even closer, determined to discover the truth. As Jonathan watched the man work, flashes of memory began flooding his mind. The posture, the way he moved his hands, everything was vaguely familiar. He approached carefully, trying to find the right words. You're George Miller?" Jonathan asked, almost in disbelief. The man looked up, surprised by the recognition. George blinked a few times as if trying to adjust his vision. "Jonathan!" His voice was choked, a mixture of surprise and shame. He hadn't expected to run into one of his former players, especially someone who had become so successful. Jonathan, in turn, felt a whirlwind of emotions. There stood the man who had guided, motivated, and turned him into a star. And now that same man was fixing a wall like any ordinary laborer. The two men stood in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Jonathan finally broke the silence. I didn't know you were still in town. George shrugged, a resigned gesture. Life didn't turn out the way I expected. I stayed here, doing what I can to survive. Jonathan felt a pang of sadness. He had always thought of George as an invincible figure, a man who shaped the destinies of others. Seeing his former coach in such a difficult situation was a shock. You changed my life, George, Jonathan said sincerely. Everything I achieved, I owe to you. George smiled, but it was a sad smile. I'm happy for you, Jonathan. You always had talent and determination. It was only a matter of time before you succeeded. He paused, glancing at the unfinished work. As for me, things just didn't work out. Jonathan, sensing the sadness in George's words, tried to lighten the conversation. I remember how you always said that winning wasn't the most important thing, but what we learned along the way. I carry that with me to this day. George nodded slowly, as if reflecting on his own past words. You know, Jonathan continued, I would never have gotten where I am without your teachings. And I'm not just talking about basketball tactics. You taught us about resilience, teamwork, and the value of never giving up. George lowered his head, moved, but trying not to show it. I was just doing my job, he replied humbly. Jonathan felt an urgency to do something, to help the man who had meant so much to him. But how? He knew George was proud and independent. It wouldn't be easy to offer help without hurting his pride. Can we talk later? Jonathan suggested. I'd love to hear more about how you've been. And maybe find a way to help. George hesitated but nodded. Sure, we can talk. But don't feel obligated to do anything, Jonathan. I manage as best I can. Jonathan smiled, a smile that mixed gratitude and concern. All right, how about coffee tomorrow? There's a cafe downtown where we can talk more comfortably. George agreed, and the two parted ways. Jonathan went home, thoughtful, while George resumed his work, the weight of memories and current reality lingering over him. That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. The image of George, crouched and aged, haunted him. He remembered the inspiring speeches, the brilliant tactics, and George's tireless dedication. How could someone so capable and talented end up in such a desperate situation? The next day, Jonathan invited George for coffee. They met in a small downtown cafe, a quiet place where they could talk without interruptions. George was visibly uncomfortable. He wasn't used to receiving kindness, especially from someone as successful as Jonathan. They began reminiscing about the old days, recalling the victories and defeats, the laughs and the challenges. Jonathan commented on how George's training had prepared him to face life's challenges. You always knew how to bring out the best in us, even when we didn't believe in ourselves, Jonathan said, taking a sip of coffee. Those were good times, George replied, smiling nostalgically. Those boys, you all had an energy, a passion for the game that was contagious. But time is relentless, isn't it? He paused, looking out the window. After you and the others left, things changed quickly. The fans started demanding more victories, and the new players didn't have the same passion and dedication. We started losing, and the pressure only increased. I couldn't find a solution, and the team began to fall apart. The university's administration lost patience and fired me. Jonathan was shocked. But you were the best coach that university ever had. How could they do that to you? George shrugged. In sports, you're only as good as your last win. And when the wins stop coming, people forget what you've done. George explained how, after being fired, he tried to find work at other universities and teams, but his reputation as a loser followed him. No one wanted to take a risk on him. He eventually distanced himself from basketball, a painful decision that left him feeling lost and directionless. It was hard, he admitted, watching everything I had worked for crumble and being powerless to stop it. Jonathan felt a deep sadness. And how did you end up doing odd jobs? George sighed, stirring his cup of coffee. I needed to pay the bills. I started with some gardening work, then recycling. It's honest, but far from what I used to do. Jonathan was silent for a moment, thinking about how to help George without hurting his pride. You know, George, I always thought you had a special talent for teaching, not just the sport, but life lessons as well. Have you ever thought about coaching again, even in a different way? George looked at Jonathan, surprised by the question. Going back to basketball? I'm not sure. It's been so long. What if I fail again? Jonathan shook his head. You won't fail. You're one of the best mentors I've ever known. I'm sure you still have so much to offer, not just in basketball but in life. George pondered Jonathan's words, feeling a spark of hope ignite in his heart. Jonathan listened carefully, increasingly disturbed by George's situation. He knew he couldn't leave things as they were. George, you don't deserve to live like this, he said firmly. You've changed so many lives, including mine. You deserve more than this. George looked down, embarrassed. That's life, Jonathan. We don't always get what we deserve. I made mistakes, let success get to my head, and wasn't prepared to handle the challenges. Now, I'm just trying to survive. Jonathan couldn't accept that answer. He had an idea, something that could change everything for George. What if you went back to basketball? George raised his eyes, surprised. What do you mean? I've been thinking, Jonathan continued, his excitement growing. What if we opened a basketball school together? You have so much knowledge and experience. We could teach the next generation of players, give them the skills and wisdom you gave us. And maybe we could even participate in some local tournaments. George remained silent, clearly touched by the proposal but also hesitant. I don't know, Jonathan. It's been so long. What if I fail again? Jonathan shook his head firmly. You won't fail. I believe in you and I bet many others do too. Besides, wouldn't it be wonderful to do something you love again? You could leave an even greater legacy. George seemed to consider the idea. He looked out the cafe window, contemplating the bustling street. I really do miss basketball, he admitted. I miss teaching, seeing young players grow and improve. But I'm scared. I don't know if I have what it takes to start over. Jonathan smiled. You won't have to do it alone. I'll be right by your side. We'll start small, build something from the ground up. No rush, no unrealistic expectations. Just for the love of the game. George felt a mix of emotions. The thought of coaching young players again was tempting, but the fear of failure still weighed heavily on him. It's a very generous offer, Jonathan. But I don't want to be a burden to you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. George, Jonathan replied, with a seriousness he rarely showed. You were never a burden. You were a mentor, a guide, and more than that, a friend. This is the least I can do to give back for everything you've done for me. Let's do this together. George took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of Jonathan's sincerity. The idea of having a second chance, of being able to teach again, started to seem less daunting. All right, he said finally, a faint smile appearing on his lips. Let's try. But let's do it the right way, with heart and no rush. Jonathan smiled, relieved and excited. It's going to be amazing, you'll see. And don't worry about the money or the facilities. I'll take care of that. You just need to do what you do best, teach and inspire. They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing ideas, from choosing a location to how they would attract young people interested in learning basketball. For George, each detail was a reminder of what he loved about the sport, and he began to feel more and more excited about the prospect of coaching again. As they said their goodbyes, Jonathan put his hand on George's shoulder. We're in this together, he said. We're going to build something special, something that will make a difference in these kids' lives. George nodded, his eyes shining with determination. We will, he replied, feeling rejuvenated. We'll start from scratch and build something we can be proud of. The idea started to take root in George's mind. The more he thought about it, the more he felt an old flame rekindling inside him. Jonathan's proposal was risky, but it was also an opportunity for redemption, a chance to correct past mistakes and leave a new legacy. The two began planning, discussing details and possibilities. Jonathan would handle the initial funding and logistics, while George focused on developing the curriculum and training sessions. they decided to open the school in an old gym in the city, a place that had once been the stage for so many thrilling games. The thought of reviving that space and giving new life to local basketball filled George with hope. They started with a small group of enthusiastic young basketball players, children of local residents. On the first day, as the young athletes arrived, George felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Could he do this again? He put himself at the forefront, greeting the young players and their parents, remembering the days when he had done the same with his old team. "Welcome, everyone." George greeted the young players with a warm smile. "I'm so happy to see you all here. We're going to learn together, and most importantly, we're going to have fun." The kids looked at him curiously, some recognizing his name from the glory days. The first few weeks were challenging. George had to get used to coaching again, finding ways to motivate and inspire the young players. But gradually, he began to rediscover his voice. The kids soaked up his every word, fascinated by his stories and advice. Jonathan also got involved, sharing his experience as a professional player and helping to strengthen the bond between the students and the sport. "When I was young like you, George taught me that basketball isn't just about shooting or dribbling," Jonathan told a group of young players during a training session. "It's about strategy, teamwork, and never giving up, even when things get tough." Word about the school spread quickly. Soon, more and more young players signed up, attracted by the opportunity to learn from a local basketball legend. George, who had initially hesitated to take on such a public role again, began to find joy and satisfaction in his work. He saw the positive impact he was having on these young players' lives, helping them develop skills and, more importantly, confidence in themselves. Jonathan had been right. George still had a lot to offer. He rediscovered his love for the game, not through wins and trophies, but through the growth and development of the young players. The school wasn't just a place to learn basketball, it was a place to build character, to teach resilience and teamwork. "You're all amazing," George told his students after a particularly intense practice. "Each one of you has the potential to be a great player, but more importantly, great people. Remember, what we learn here goes beyond the court." The parents of the students also began to notice the difference in their children. "My daughter is more confident and disciplined," a mother commented. "She's always talking about Coach George and how inspiring he is." The gym, once abandoned, was now full of life and energy. Jonathan and George decided to sign the school up for local tournaments, giving the young players a chance to test their skills in a competitive environment. For George, seeing the transformation of these young players and their enthusiasm for basketball was the greatest reward he could ask for. The months flew by, and the basketball school became a cornerstone of the community. The old gym, once abandoned, was now brimming with life and energy. Jonathan and George decided to register the school for local tournaments, giving the young players the chance to test their skills in a competitive setting. In their first tournament, expectations were low. The school was still in its early stages, and many of the young players had little competitive experience. However, to everyone's surprise, the team not only competed but stood out. The teamwork and technical skills developed under George's guidance were evident in every game. The most exciting moment came during the championship final. The school faced off against a highly skilled team known for its aggressive tactics. It was a close game, with each point fiercely contested. In the end, George and Jonathan's team narrowly lost, but the result didn't matter. The performance of the young players was celebrated by everyone, and the crowd, made up of parents, friends, and community members, couldn't have been prouder. After the game, George was approached by several parents and community members, all praising his work and thanking him for the positive impact he'd had on their children's lives. He felt a surge of emotions, a mix of pride and gratitude. For the first time in many years, he felt like he was in the right place, making a meaningful difference. "You've done an incredible job with these kids," said one father, shaking George's hand. "My son has never been so motivated. He talks about your training all the time." "Thank you," George replied with a genuine smile. "These young players have so much potential. It's a pleasure to see them grow and develop." Jonathan, standing beside George, was equally radiant. He saw in George not just a coach, but a mentor and a friend who had been reborn through his love of the sport. "I told you you still had a lot to give," he said, smiling. George smiled back, his eyes filled with tears. "You were right, Jonathan. It's not about wins or losses. It's about teaching, passing on what we've learned, and inspiring others. That's what truly matters." With the success of the basketball school, Jonathan and George began planning for the future. There was so much more to do, more young people to inspire and teach. They discussed expanding the school, perhaps even opening branches in other towns. But for now, they were content to focus on the community that had embraced them. "I think we can do something even bigger," Jonathan said, as the two reviewed sign-ups for the next semester. "Maybe we can create programs to help kids from underprivileged neighborhoods, give them the chance to learn and grow through the sport." George nodded, excited by the prospect. Yes, it would be incredible to give more young people that opportunity. Basketball is more than just a game, it's a school of life. And so, the gym continued to echo with the sound of bouncing basketballs, cheers of encouragement, and the laughter of young players. George and Jonathan, united by their shared past and a mutual love of basketball, had created something truly special. A place where the spirit of the sport and the power of community converged, and where the true meaning of success was redefined, not by the trophies on the shelf, but by the positive impact on the lives of others. George had found a new purpose and a fresh start, not in the spotlight or in the headlines, but in the joy of teaching and guiding the next generation. Jonathan, in turn, had found a way to give back and keep his mentor's legacy alive. Together, they built a vibrant community and a bright future for many young players.